Thank you very much. I'll try to make this brief. The exhibition covers 400 years, so you can realize there's going to be some compression. This is an exhibition that might well have been constructed for this symposium, or conversely, the symposium for the exhibition. Neither one of them is true. The circumstance has to do with the zeitgeist, and the only problem is that the zeitgeist is off calibration by 1 week. The exhibition will open in 1 week from now, and so what I'm going to give you tonight is just a brief kind of, I hope, tantalizing sense of what's in it. It'll have to take the form of a kind of delayed gratification, which I hope will encourage you to come back and have a look at the exhibition when it does open. It'll be up until October 7th. Can I have the first slide on the left? Okay, and the lights down. The exhibition is called The Unfinished Print, a very blunt and, by some accounts, unimaginative title, but it does say what it is that I mean, and it is, in a sense, essentially appropriate to what it is that you're considering. It's, to put it in art historical parlance, the non finito problem in the history of printmaking. And what I do is make a case, or try to make a case, for the fact that prints have a very special status in this context. That is to say, there's something about prints, about the nature of their making especially, that causes them to be separable from other modes of working up an object that reflects on the question of non finito in ways that are kind of revealing and suggestive. The basic facts here have to do with the nature of what it means to make a print, at least in the standard classical forms, namely an engraving or an etching. You begin with a plate, you work on that plate, and the image gradually accumulates in the course of that work. But it's an artifact of the technology, so to speak, that as you do this, you take impressions as you go along, or you may do, you may not do, but typically was done, because you're working in reverse and you're working on a plate which is difficult to read, and the product, so to speak, is something that issues from it and has a fundamentally different character. And this is, as I say, simply something that derives from the technology itself, but what it yields is a scattered kind of record, depending upon when and how and why people chose to retain these impressions. A record of the development of a thing, the record of an evolution that is not just a sort of gestation, but a kind of track of the genesis itself. And one can talk about this naturally in relation to a painting, where one finds very often preparatory drawings that are accumulated and so forth in advance of a painting, oil sketches and so forth. But the distinctive thing about a print is that these alterations are made in the very matrix that yields the final image. So it constructs a sort of palimpsest that resolves itself in a certain way. And my premise is that printmakers took this matter very seriously, not just as a practical matter, but the very fact of having been able to accumulate records of this kind may have caused them to reflect on the nature of how they proceeded from one stage to another in ways that were perhaps different. And there is a history here, a history of greater and lesser interest that we can trace through surviving impressions, and one that extends the problem beyond simply the question of recording process to the issue of an interest in variability in general in printmaking. The obvious character of a print, initially at least, is its uniformity, the possibility of reproducing a great number of things that are, as Ivans referred to it, exactly repeatable pictorial statements. Printmakers fairly early on started to resist that, partly for commercial reasons, partly because they were more imaginative than that. There's always a tension throughout this history between the prerogatives of commerce on the one hand and the tendency to experiment, which I think may have a great deal to do with the fact that they were playing with a new kind of technology, albeit a rather simple kind of technology. So that's the general premise that underlies this, and I began to look at the question over a broad period of time with the assumption that an interest in these variants along the way kinds of prints was something that would rise in a kind of steady fashion, that it would form a fairly clear trajectory. And in fact, it doesn't. It goes through some fascinating kinds of oscillations. Artists' interest in this dimension of their work, and indeed correspondingly collectors' interests in having it. And this is an essential dialectic that runs throughout the whole history of the story. That is, printmakers start to retain things, and then they begin to attract the attention of collectors, and that motivates them to start playing around in a variety of ways with their plates and with their papers and so forth, the way they print things, to generate special impressions of things. And it becomes almost cultic at certain phases. And then there are other stages where there's an outright resistance to this. And this is a question that can be connected with shifts in, for example, the history of art theory in Western Europe. Now, the first print we know of that was manifestly unfinished, Hendrik Goltzius's Adoration of the Shepherds, manifestly unfinished, and meanwhile something that was of interest, that is to say, was purveyed, was sold by not the artist, but his son-in-law, clearly attracted interest, has a special sort of status. It begins the story. There are a number of proof impressions that survive before that, but this in a way is a stepping off point. And it's a particularly interesting one because it arises out of a visual culture that was intensely invested in high degrees of finish, over-refinement, one might say. Goltzius, in fact, is on record as having not allowed people to see his work until it was completed. His son-in-law overrode that, probably posthumously, but certainly as a testimonial to the master's hand. What's striking about it, I think, is that as you look at it, see the figure of the shepherds on the left, Joseph in the center, extending a candle forward into the void where the Christ child eventually would have emerged, and on the right-hand side, the Virgin. It strikes us moderns, I think, immediately as an architectonic construction that really couldn't be added to without deficit. It's magnificently composed. I would not by any means suggest that Goltzius intended to leave it for that purpose, but the fact remains. And the fact also remains that this object was chosen, selected out, and purveyed, possibly within Goltzius's lifetime and certainly immediately after his death. So there's a beginning point here. The circumstances are special, but they're intriguing. 35 years later, could I have the next slide on the left? 35 years later, you come to Rembrandt, who begins to do things like this. In fact, he did a number of plates like this. They're referred to as sketch sheets for obvious reasons, appropriate to our interests here. And they're initially, of course, highly experimental. They're obviously experimental. They're bizarre. They're oftentimes random. This is among the most peculiar. But more peculiar than that is the fact that the evidence of watermarks suggests that these objects were actually disseminated at the time. It wasn't simply a question of Rembrandt playing around with a plate in order to improve his capacity for refined etching. Rembrandt was doing something else. Exactly what he was doing is a difficult question to answer, particularly since this is early on in his career. These come from the 1630s, which is a surprising moment for someone to presume, let's say, that people would be interested in these kinds of toss-offs from his studio. But apparently they were. And there are enough of them to suggest that he took this quite seriously and indeed came back to them, altered them, sometimes cut them up, and made them into different prints. But a composition like this comes across initially as completely bizarre. I've oriented it this way. The gallery has it matted 90 degrees around. I kind of like this because of the magnificent study of the beret and the one eye staring at us, which is possibly a self-portrait. Who knows? One can hardly say. My guess is that Rembrandt is kind of playing with us on that front. Directly above the hat, you'll see a little detail of an eye, which has been worked as though it were the other eye. And then, of course, probably the first composition was this little landscape that you see projected off over the top. Rembrandt is the person who really explodes the whole question of unfinished. That is to say, he opens up all the doors in the issue, and I think is, in this regard, a fundamental prophet of modernity. and therefore the exhibition concentrates on him at a significant moment. He is given one full room, and the full range of possibilities of finish and unfinished as they emerge in his work are explored. Could I have the next slide on the left? The remote isn't responding. In a certain sense, the whole question for Rembrandt can be summed up in this print. Manifestly unfinished, there's no question about that. This wasn't abandoned intentionally, I don't think, although people have actually argued that. It's a fascinating print, in part because it is an allegory of the arts, and it is specifically about drawing, about the means and the implications of drawing. What you see in the unfinished areas in the lower portion is an artist on the left, suggestive enough of a self-portrait that we may take it as a self-portrait in some generic sense, looking at a model, obviously modeled on a classical Venus type with consequent allusion to a muse. In a studio, the muse bears a palm shown in two forms, the loosely sketched dry point in the lower portion of it and the finished work above it. Other props around, studio props you can see hanging there, and just behind him a blank canvas with the top of an easel resting above it and sculpture, so it's also a paragone. There can't be any doubt this is an allegory of the arts. There can't be any doubt that it's a reflection on the art of drawing, and that the basic questions of 17th century thinking on this matter are being raised here, namely the proper relationship to nature and the proper relationship to antiquity. But the print was abandoned at this stage. We have no notion why. It's been suggested that Rembrandt may have meant to leave it this way as a demonstration piece. I don't believe that, but the fact is, again, that this print was printed and circulated within Rembrandt's lifetime. We can't say for certain that it was done so by him, but there's every reason to suppose that it was. A case like this suggests that Rembrandt had a very high degree of self-consciousness about the nature of his own process and the importance not just of recording it, but also of disseminating it, and indeed disseminating it beyond, let's say, the circle of workshop apprentices, artists, and so forth, to an audience that we would classify now as collectors. The other dimensions of Rembrandt's interest in unfinished, I think, are known to most of you. Could I have the next slides left and right? Namely, the great cases of variations in states. I show you just one instance of that here, the famous three crosses, which you see on the left in a first state and on the right-hand side in the final fourth state, where the whole plate has been violently reworked, a major figure introduced to the center, the whole thing scored over with Burin and dry point to create what is in effect an entirely different image, and certainly one that is profoundly different in mood and character. Question arises why Rembrandt chose to develop that image in this way, effectively to engage in an act of iconoclasm on an earlier image in order to bring forth an entirely new conception, rather than, as we might imagine, it might have been easier to have begun with a different plate. There's an implication about the importance of process and about the engagement with the material and the technology of printmaking here that is, I think, fundamental. Rembrandt's reputation varied. In the 18th century, he was widely criticized for the roughness of his style, and many people remarked on the fact that he left so many things unfinished. It was a problem for them in somewhat the same way that Vasari found Michelangelo and Leonardo's work to be a problem, but it was reinforced by classical theory at this point, and so a debate arose. The 18th century was a quite different climate in general, so far as the question of prints and their value and understanding was concerned, at least in, we might say, official or conventional forms of patronage. Next slides, left and right. And here the exhibition takes a turn to reproductive prints after paintings, Watteau, Fragonard, and so forth. This is a case of an etched-only proof on the left-hand side, a little difficult to make out, but I think you'll see it's all there. And on the right-hand side, the finished proof, which has been worked up with an engraving tool. This is an extremely interesting moment. These paintings are intended, of course, to evoke the qualities of the paintings they copy. It was made for a corpus of paintings by Watteau, the so-called Recueil Julien. the proof states, etched-only proof states, were issued in significant number. The gallery has quite a large collection of them. A significant enough number that they were clearly distributed and valued. The implications are clear there. In the 19th century, they were highly valued, but it's obvious that simply from their presence that this was also true at the time in which they were made. It's interesting here to reflect on the implication of this difference. What you have in the first go-round in the drawing with the etching needle, which gives you more or less the complete composition, is something that is essential and by its very nature a print. Whereas in the other, you have an endeavor that is really directed towards subordinating itself to the demands of a painting. And to me, or at least this is how I interpret this phenomenon, to me what we have here is a kind of resistance to that, we might say a resistance to uniformity in a general sense, and also an appreciation for qualities of drawing that become manifest more fluidly and beautifully in the first stage of activity, namely what we might call the sketch, although it would be wrong, I think, to refer to this in a conventional sense as a sketch, but nevertheless a previous stage of becoming. The other half of the 18th century engages Piranesi on a kind of eccentric track, semi-my own, namely looking at Piranesi's work at his process, in particular in relationship to his subject matter, namely the ruin, and the way in which Piranesi approaches his plate, oftentimes aggressively, and I developed this into a kind of proto-romantic Sturm und Drang reading of an interest in not only underfinish in the state changes that you find there, but also extending into dimensions of overfinish. I'm going to leap from here. I'll just mention a couple of things that I think you will find interesting. These are also discussed in the catalog. In the 19th century, the question kind of explodes in a very multifaceted way. There's a marvelous series of states of a print by the French artist Charles Meryon, in which he goes through a series of stages, encounters Baudelaire at one point, is committed to Charenton, a psychoanalytic hospital, emerges and produces the final state of the print after he returns from the hospital. The plate effectively but very ambiguously and fascinatingly chronicles the state of Meryon's mind as he moves through it, almost as if he were, well, I guess I wouldn't say that it was an act of therapy. I'd stop short of that, but in any case, he made use of it as a reflection of his own condition. And the exhibition ends in the early part of the 20th century with Gauguin and some of Gauguin's cruder techniques for generating printed images that were kind of technical maneuverings intended to generate a kind of primitivism, a sort of contradiction in terms, if you like, that leads us into a point where I draw the line beyond my competence. The 20th century comes after, and in a certain sense, I think it's fair to say that the whole issue of finish and unfinish becomes indefinitely suspended. So far as the considerations here are concerned, I might just mention a couple of things that seem to me to reflect on the problem of the sketch. There's a parallel here in the history of the print, the unfinished print, in the visual arts with what particularly Paul Sanger was talking about, the edited draft of a text, or for that matter, of a piece of music, which is not something one can find in quite the same way in other dimensions of the visual arts. It's clearly an artifact of the print revolution. That's fundamental, I think, to understanding what's going on here. And secondly, it's interesting to me, at least, that we have, in effect, rough drafts for Rembrandt's prints, but we don't have any rough drafts for, say, Shakespeare's plays. And that fact alone is suggestive. And I will pause there, and if people have questions, I would be happy to answer them. Yes.
Perhaps you draw this distinction in your catalog, but I think a sharp one should be made between those images of which, those plates which are deliberately changed, like the Rembrandt Three Crosses, and those flutes, like the Bolsey showed first.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the only unfinished plate in the history of prints. I mean, I can think of two from the Poitiers shop.
Oh, there are a great, vast number of them,
Yeah.
of course.
Well, what is remarkable about impressions like that is the great control that these engravers had. It was a proof, but they knew where they were going. It wasn't that they were searching. They knew, they wanted to see where they were, but they had already engraved very deeply.
Yeah.
And they were going to
Oh, yeah.
up in the end and
Mhm.
pull it all together. But it's just a fluke that the plate survived or that impression.
Right. I mean, I think overall, if one's thinking about this in the context of the sketch, it's clear that something like the Goltzius is an entirely different phenomenon. There, what one is talking about is an incomplete object, unquestionably. Here, the interesting question becomes: why is it interesting? Why is it interesting, particularly at that moment in the patronage relationship? With Rembrandt, you can really begin to talk about the evolution of plates as an evolving process of thinking and resolution. There, it is very different. Yes, Irving.
I promised I would shut up, but now I can't.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that I want to comment on the Goltzius. It seems to me. Speak up, please. And I want to comment on the Goltzius because it seems to me a stunning event.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, it is elaborately signed.
Right.
Whoever did it, it's intended for what it is, unless the whole thing is a mess, but it's not. And I would submit that what it is really is a reflection of the Brigittine Nativity. The Brigittine Nativity in which Bridget has a vision of the Christ child who is luminous, light emits from the Christ child. In this particular case, it seems to me that there is a deliberate juxtaposition of the candle and the blank sheet
Oh, yeah,
of page.
definitely.
I mean that, and I'm sure he meant it specifically because the literature on that subject is full of the idea that artificial light, namely a candle, for example, pales before the true light of Jesus. So that it's what's remarkable to me in that context is, number one, how non-fluke it is to begin with, but secondly, the idea of using the blank page in that way seems to me that particularly printmaker's device. So I wonder whether the whole image, that one, isn't dependent on the fact, or evolved from the fact that it is in fact a print, and therefore makes use of the paper in a very different way from any drawing that I know of.
I think the best way to answer the question is very mundane, for which I apologize, and that is to say, if you look at Goltzius' work in general, the kind of metaphorical leap that you're suggesting there is highly unlikely because his aesthetic and intellectual preferences point so strongly in different directions. I find the suggestion very appealing. That is to say, one can imagine, although it would be a high order of speculation, that Goltzius sensed at a moment that there was something right about that. And I'm very attracted to that notion. And that sense could have been complicated in any number of ways, including the one you've suggested. I do, however, think it unlikely that he would have issued the print himself. The signature is Goltzius, but we don't know that he put his own mark on it, although he did. There are other cases of unfinished states of prints that never got completed where his mark is on them. It's signed by his son-in-law Matam, who took over his operation and actually issued the print. Matam signs it, though, as his publisher, not as someone who participated in the making, so he separates himself out, and hence the implication of its honorific character. It's something to put in one's mind. There's another question? Yeah.
Getting back to Rembrandt.
Mm-hmm.
There
Oh, yes.
So that would
Yeah.
look like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of just
Yes, very much. In fact, most of the comments that are made about, the annoyances that are expressed about his unfinished prints are simply spin-offs from a general aggravation about his painting style, in particular his late painting style, which was really obnoxious to French classical theorists in particular. So there's a whole debate that goes on about that. But yes, it carries over very consistently. And I think one can discuss and analyze the question in certain ways that are particular to his prints, but there's absolutely no doubt that it's continuous throughout his work, and including his drawings. And his self-consciousness as a draftsman, everyone is aware of, and the fact of the number that survive is a clear enough indication that he too put enormous value in that, even no matter how far you want to pare the corpus down. I think when you look at a sketch plate like that first one that I showed you with the sort of semi-self-portrait and then the allegory of art, these are all in the 30s, effectively the first decade in which he starts making prints. And there's no question, much as with Michelangelo, I think, that you're dealing with a personality that from very early on is self-mythologizing. And the whole print operation is playing a part in that.
There was a question in the last row. Yes.
Actually, it relates to the question that we just posed about the continuum in Rembrandt, that we have to see the unfinished prints in conjunction with the drawings and the paintings, and that oftentimes, for example, the big crosses can be related to the way in which he produces pentimenti, except we don't have the traces of all of those narrative changes that impact finished paintings.
Right.
But regarding the Holzius, just not to add too much complication to the discussion, I was thinking, given the fact that you were so fascinated by the basically the liminal areas between different media, drawing and print, and the pen webcam and the ink useless painting and vice versa, would it be possible to speculate that the unfinished state here was essentially like the background for him to introduce the Christ child in a different medium? In other words, perhaps it's a pen drawing and then bury Christ child going through the variations on the life of the Virgin, or his famous series where he essentially tries to outdo himself and to make reference to a host of older models.
That and I don't mean to be dismissive. You mean that it was a sort of coloring book opportunity?
But perhaps in his case even that.
Yeah.
Given his interest and proclivity towards that medium.
To come back briefly to Carolyn's point earlier, one of the curious things about the Dutch Mannerist printmakers, and they're highly skilled. They represent an order of virtuosity that is certainly unequaled in the history of print or of engraving. Let's put it that way. There are a great many surviving proof states and unfinished prints. This is a marking point because we know it was issued in the way that it was, and that's why I make use of it in that fashion. But why so many of them have survived in unfinished states is a fascinating question. Why so many proof states survive? Because they're all aimed at high degrees of finish and horror vacui in the end. The Mannerist aesthetic is pointed in that direction. I think it may have something to do with the pure degree of labor involved, that some of these things were just given up because there are too many other things on the plate. That may be a kind of intuition that I've had now that I've moved from the academy to become a curator. Certain things just disappear from you.
Thank you very much.